All right, we're back with you here on In Focus. As I mentioned, the Deputy Defense Minister, Bantu Holomisa, is in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to attend the African Defense Ministers Conference. The general, who is representing South Africa, will be involved in talks on border security management and counter-terrorism, amongst others. He joins us now for an update. General, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. It's a 4-day event, and what will really be the outcome of this is Africa's role in achieving peace and global security, where at this time, unfortunately, we are speaking of an escalation of tensions in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. What is your view on the role that South Africa, particularly in the last 20 years, has been playing in active global peacekeeping efforts?
Well, from the day President Mandela docked his ship in Congo, wherein he met the president of DRC, then Kabila and others. And then from there, South Africa went to Burundi, and then we've been involved in other parts of the continent in assisting for them to find solutions where there have been conflict. Yes, South Africa has invested a lot in promoting peace in the continent. I guess that's why we are highly respected. You will also recall that President Mbeki was also assisting the AU after he left government in Pretoria, in particular to put systems around the AU. But what we were discussing here in the last 2 days, we were discussing the existing world order and its impact on Africa.
Yeah.
That is from colonial era to our democratic systems in the continent from early 60s, which was characterized, unfortunately, by corruption and conflicts, which compromised peace in the continent.
Yes.
So the security challenges in Africa were discussed in detail. Obviously, when we talk about the colonial, the existing world order, we can sum it like, from West, we were colonized by West, most of the countries, if not all in the continent. Now we are once more looking towards the eastern side of the world,
yes,
where China, for instance, is currently the biggest trade partner of African country of Africa. So Africa's looting of natural resources are continuing. The question, therefore, which we were discussing is time not yet arrived for an African dialogue,
yes,
with a view to demand or position ourselves as to, in this world change of the world, what is in for Africa?
yes.
So we listed the issue of cooperation amongst the defense forces, exchange training, training courses, and also strengthen cooperation when it comes to border management,
Right.
And also to look at the free trade, of course. That has been endorsed by AU. That's the program of the AU. There's nothing new on that. But key is to cooperate on the security of the continent,
Yes.
in the countries.
How do you then appraise that kind of geopolitical realignment, if you like, politically, but also strategically speaking, because that realignment is also happening within the region. For example, as you are there right now, Somalia has demanded the exclusion of Ethiopian forces, for example, from the upcoming African Union support mission in Somalia, because alliances are changing there, leaning more towards Egypt and so on and so forth. As South Africa, how do you appraise those kinds of developments strategically in terms of how you are going to land your peacekeeping efforts?
Well, we did discuss those issues which are affected by geopolitical situations, wherein you will find that those situations even affect the free economic development or participation by many. So you will notice that the geopolitical situation also frustrates those people who want to make a living for themselves in business and so on. But if your neighbor is not cooperating or is harboring elements which are intending to overthrow your government, those are kinds of situations which are also being exploited by outsiders who wants to use one of those rebels or the governments in order to siphon the resources of the continent. So South Africa, in its approach, has always been preaching peace. And I think we must also hope, in fact, I raised this in the conference, that perhaps we are going to be judged by the world now that the UN says Africa must be represented by 2 countries. I said in the conference how I hope that the countries in the continent will not be competing against each other unnecessarily, but we will find a common ground to agree which countries must represent us, as long as those 2 countries will be promoting the interest of the continent.
As we are becoming active players, even in global peace efforts, if you look at, for example, what's happening in the Middle East, our efforts in the ICJ and so on and so forth, there is always this question of how do you balance the domestic as well as the international expectations. So one would say, what are the national interests, for example, in us agreeing to exchange intelligence information, in us agreeing to develop joint operations, in us agreeing in capacity building operations, tech transfer, and so on and so forth. What is our national interest?
Well, all those issues you have raised are contained in the framework of the AU. How do we cooperate amongst ourselves? But the question of national interest for South Africa, that is a debate which has been around for some time, but we have never had a consensus as to what kind of national interest South Africa is looking at in the continent, other than that we have positioned ourselves to be a Father Christmas of a kind to solve the conflicts in other areas. But as to whether, in fact, you can see it, we have been to Burundi, we have been to Sudan, we trained the civil servants of Burundi at UNISA, we have helped the DRC. In other countries, you will find where we are in, we get in and we bring peace, and then the big companies from the Western world follow us. And then you ask yourself a question, what about us? So we will still have to define and agree what kind of national interest South Africa needs to have in the continent, other than that we have been kind to make sure that we move with everybody. So I don't think I can define what national interest is. I think it would need parliament and perhaps presidency. But the national interest we're pushing now, it starts from the era of Mandela, that of making sure that we solve the conflicts.
In areas where we have had direct participation and unfortunately there are fatalities, when we speak, for example, to the SANDF union, they'll tell us of, I've raised this with you, of resources. Now, part of the issue that you are deliberating on there is also the use of the UN peacekeeping budgets, I suppose, in these operations. So what type of conversations are we having around resourcing the defenses, I suppose, especially in developing countries? I beg your pardon.
Well, in our case, in South Africa, in the last 25 to 30 years, SANDF has been defunded in the interest of social security. The embarrassing part of late, which National Treasury has confirmed in Parliament last week or two, was that a lot of money was used. If money which would have been given to defense was used to bail out the SOEs. You would understand the questions related to social security as opposed to military security. But it should not be done in such a way that it would compromise the security of the state. Coming back to your question about the developing world and other poor countries in terms of assisting them financially, that is the responsibility of AU and the UN Security Council. But insofar as South Africa is concerned, we have been using the South African monies. Sometimes we claim those monies from the UN Security Council, from the UN. But if your equipment is not up to standard, the UN is not going to pay you. Even if your indicators of your truck or your tires are not serviceable or whatever, the UN will penalize you. So it's important, therefore, that when we send troops to all these countries, whether it's Malawi or Mozambique, Sudan, Congo, the equipment of the SANDF must be above board.
Yeah. You mentioned the AU. How are you challenging? What is South Africa's view on the AU's role in global peacekeeping efforts when you compare it, for example, to the UN, and what are you pushing them towards?
Unfortunately, the AU seems to be handicapped when it comes to implementing its own resolutions. Some of the countries don't even pay their dues, yearly dues. That handicapped the programs, for instance, to establish the regional peacekeeping brigades, whose task is to make sure that whenever there's an early signal or there are problems, they can immediately intervene. So I don't think the AU is in a state of readiness, administratively and financially, unfortunately. And this issue was highlighted by many countries in this workshop, as well as during the time 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago when we attended the Mbeki Foundation on peace and security.